Finally finished. Finally finished. Almost too late. Hello and welcome to my channel. In this video I will be finally doing my kind of review summary of Oathbringer, the final chapter in my Stormlight Archive reread series. Now with that, there is so much to go through, so I'm going to get started right away. So one last reminder, this will be discussing and summarizing the events of the entire book, so if you've not read it, it will spoil literally the entire book for you. This is more so for getting a summary before we finally get Rhythm of War, which at the time of recording this comes out tomorrow, so can't wait to get to that point. So we start with the prologue, and we see Gavilar's assassination once again, but this time from Eshonai's angle, and we really see that they did fear him bringing back their gods, that Stony had it caused what they did, and we start to see glimpses that Venli was already actually influenced by Odium, and maybe that's why they decided to go get Seth in general. And there's a comment about how when they first met humans, they expected them to be formless, which is just another little bit of foreshadowing / clue to what we see later. And through this as well, we see that Gavilar was working with Amaran and the Sons of Honor, trying to bring back the Voidbringers and the Desolations in general to make the Heralds and Radiants return. So we'd had bits and pieces of that, but we do flat out see they were working together on this, which especially is interesting later as we continue and kind of see how these characters interact with others. So with the main story, we open up with Dalinar, and he's studying the visions of Odium's champion with the 9 shadows representing the Unmade. We see Dalinar trying to take control and form this coalition, unite Roshar. It's the thing he's been doing, unite them, but he's been trying to do this whole time. But things aren't really going all that well on that front. At the same time, he's starting to get back his missing memories, and we're kind of seeing them at the same time. The flashback showing who he was, this just horrible warlord who slaughtered many with no mercy, and basically just lived for the fight and nothing else. And he actually seems worse than Sidious at several points in the flashbacks, which is really interesting to see. Back in the real time, we see Dalinar and Navani married by the Stormfather, and Kadash warns that the Ardents are not going to look at that well, and he makes some comments that just kind of hint and show that there's still much more darkness in Dalinar's past than what we've seen so far, and we'll slowly see that play out in this book. Moving to Kaladin, and seriously, we don't get enough Kaladin in this book, but anyway, he's on his way to Hearthstone, and he's trying to find and save his parents. He pushes his way in and kind of calmly punches Rashon right in the face, and it's not for himself, you see, but it's for Moshe. And this is a really big turning point despite that, because he kind of takes control of the situation, and he realizes now there's no more time for this petty anger. There are a lot bigger problems in the world, and that's what he needs to focus on. Cutting over to Shallan, we see her dealing with the aftermath of admitting the truth to herself that she did kill her mother, and her struggles mentally are a really big part of this book overall, and it plays into a lot more than just this one event. But that's a really important setup for her in general. And then we see her and Dalinar working in concert, him being able to somehow combine with her power, and they make this really detailed map using Shallan's light weaving. And that's something I think that's going to play in later as well, with how he can kind of augment the powers of other Radiants. So, setting up 2 more plot lines, we see a second murder in the same vein as Sidious, exactly the same, and an investigation launched, headed by Adolin. Yeah, that might not work out that well. And then we also see Renarin progressing as a Radiant, and can see that he can use Stormlight and does have a blade. We continue then with Dalinar's flashbacks with his first trip to the Rift, where he slaughters the defenders, once again no mercy. He kills the High Lord, and at the time we presume his 6-year-old son, to claim Oathbringer, the shard blade that we'd always known him as having. In the main story, we see him still not able to get through to the otherworld leaders, and he wishes that things were simple like they were in the past when he just solved his problems with a sword. He starts sparring to clear his head, and that's when we actually see Dalinar start getting these memories back, and see that he's going to be getting them as we read them as well, and starting to get memories of Evie, his wife, and what he did. Jumping to the courtship of Shallan and Adeline, we see Adeline getting to know the real her, but at the same time she's kind of created a new identity, Radiant, and she thinks that's who he wants and that he wouldn't want her. They practice shard blades, and we get just the great scene of Pattern, who's acting as the chaperone, and just yells no mating anytime they get too close, and that just gets me every time. I love that little section there. Back to Kaladin, after leaving Hearthstone, he travels with some converted parchment, and he finds that they seem pretty normal. They seem like any other runaway slaves he's known, and really they're rebelling against their terrible enslavement. They lost not just their freedom, but their minds, and he can identify with them and sees that, they don't necessarily want war and want to fight, but they see no other way. And he struggles to figure out what really is the right thing to do here, which is a theme that does come back in a big way later on. Meanwhile, Adeline and Shallan are investigating the murder of Sidious, and when talking to Iolai, Shallan sees Mraize of the Ghostbloods, who's one of her Liadet attendants, and he charges her to expunge the darkness from Urthuru, meaning the unmade that's there that's causing the kind of the double murders to happen. In return, her brothers will be delivered safely, and she'll get news of Halloran and what the events surrounding his death were. At this point, Adeline does tell her that Kaladin is actually the one who killed Ellorin and not Amarin like she had thought, but in general this kind of continues on the unmade plot, which is really the big plot of part 1. And we get some more hints as she's telling the story of the girl who looked up as to the big reveal later on. Back with Dalinar, he realizes the other leaders still really only see him as a conqueror and don't believe he wants peace. This is reinforced as we see more visions of Dalinar as just a drunkard and a brute and very effective in war, but basically nothing else. He seems barely human when he's not fighting, and less than human when he is fighting. And we really see the full effect of the thrill in his flashback memories, seeing him just seeing red and attacking, and almost once even killing Gavilar. He'd mentioned that before, and this was the first time he actually kind of got to see that. But he does find out from the Stormfather in the main timeline that he could actually bring others into his visions with him, so he hatches a plan to use that to see the other world leaders face to face. Still in Urthuru, Shallan and the identities she's created, she's kind of losing herself in them. And she starts to chase the Unmade, the Midnight Mother, into the battles of the city, finally facing off. And Shallan finds that she understands the powerful Spren and is able to scare her away, something to do with her light weaving. Also something very important later on for understanding the Unmade. And kind of finds this big secret room that seems to be very important to the running of Urthuru in general. Kaladin, meanwhile, is forced to leave the Parchment as a storm is coming. He tries to save everyone. They weren't prepared for the storm. The human slaves are just kind of out in the open. And even though he discovers a new form of power where the Windspren come and he's kind of controlling the wind and fighting against the storm itself, it's not enough and he's not able to save everyone. So feeling pretty broken about that, he makes his way back to Urthuru, traveling with the storm. And last, but certainly not least, with the end of part 1, Yasna Kholin at last returns to Urthuru. So a quick note on the epigraphs in part 1. They do have relevance later, and I'm not saying they don't, but I honestly just found them annoying. They really don't offer anything new, and the epigraphs have been so important and had such a high standard in the other books and the rest of it in this book that I just felt like they added nothing, kind of kept repeating the same thing, and I didn't care for them. Now, getting to the interludes, first we see Puli, who's in New Ninatin, and he's a lighthouse keeper, and he's watching for those who are supposed to come from the origin. So that's something that, once again, setting up a further mystery. We're not really sure what that means, and we don't really get an answer in this book. Next, we see Elistra, who's an Ardent in the Horneater Peaks, and she's just focused on a romance novel, but this allows us to see another Ardent who has a patron, Taravangian, who is desperately wanting them to finish translating a section of the Dawn Chant, which will come into play later as well. We then get another look at Venli. We do get confirmation that Eshonai is dead, and there is a strange Spren that was following her and around the body, and begins following Venli. We also get confirmation that the listener ancestors are indeed those in charge of the war. That had kind of already been established, but it's kind of said point blank here that it's their spirits have come back to inhabit bodies, and they're the ones who are leading this fight. Part 2 in Oathbringer sees many characters questioning their place in the world, and this continues with some of the slower paced section. I will say it does a lot for character development, but the first couple parts of Oathbringer are just a lot slower, and so it kind of slogs just a little bit, although it does make up for it later, to be fair. So we see Shallan struggling to fit in back as Yasna's ward, and really rebelling against being back in that place. She has accomplished so much on her own, even now scaring off one of the Unmade, and so she just can't really fit back in that place, but it continues to think maybe she'll be a different person for that, a different person outside. She does get more information from the Ghostbloods in confirmation that Helleran was actually a part of the Skybreakers, and that Gavilar and Amaran were in the Sons of Honor, which we saw at the very beginning, but now she's got that information as well. And also confirms that they don't have an issue with Ishna spying for Vale, and so Ishna ends up getting added to Shallan's crew along with Vathan and Gaz and the others. So, Yasna is continuing to research her through, and this is kickstarted when Renerin discovers the Gemstone Library, which holds records of the Last Radiance. And it sounds like she already knows the deep secret, though, that we're going to find out later. And then we spend a lot of time with current and former members of Bridge 4, and all of them are questioning their place. We see Sigil, and he just feels like he stands out because he's learned and he can write. And he doesn't just want to be a scribe, he wants to be a true part of Bridge 4 with the rest. Rock, knowing his role is important as the cook and he won't fight, but also knowing that that does make him stand out. And he chooses to still remain as cook even after the arrival of his family, makes it very clear that he's now the eldest, and so basically like a Bright Lord in his land. And we continue on looking at the others as well. And there's lots of the members of Bridge 4, that was always a theme, they were misfits, they didn't fit in, but it's really just kind of seeing all of them deal with it. We see Teft, and he's addicted to fire moss, and he feels like it's only a matter of time until he betrays Bridge 4 like he's betrayed everyone else in his life. He, however, we see, has bonded to Sprim, so despite feeling like the most broken of the bunch, he has actually moved a step further than the others at this point. We do see Moshe several times in this part as well. At first he's regretting the past and leaving Bridge 4, and then Graves and the rest of the Diagram members with him are attacked by the Fused, and they're all slain except for Moshe, who slays one of the Fused, and for that feat is brought back and spared. He gets put into with slaves, and then just kind of realizes that nothing's really changed. It doesn't matter if the world's ending. Even with the slaves, the Light Eyes are still in charge. But he does notice that the Parshendi actually treat their slaves better, typically, than humans did. So he feels like he's kind of back where he started, but he sees there's one group of Parshendi, it was the ones that Kaladin had traveled with, are being harassed and treated very poorly. He decides to step in and protect them and try to do at least a little bit of good. And then he actually ends up being offered freedom and the opportunity to officially join the side of the Fused. Finally, then we see R'hllane, and he's really the true outcast of Bridge 4. He's not even a human, he's a Parshman, and he's really basically the last of his kind that wasn't taken and changed by the Everstorm or destroyed by him. And he is thinking about how he knows, even though the others kind of accept him, he's just an afterthought. They don't encourage him for surges because we've known it's impossible for him to do surges, and it's just kind of something they don't think about and they don't realize. And he knows they mean well, but it really is hard being literally the only one of your species here. And so everyone else gets accepted after a fashion, but he still feels like an afterthought. We then go and we see Dalinar trying to find his footing, bringing Queen Fen and later Ga to try to show them what's coming in the visions and what happened in the past, and really convince them to join his coalition. Later he brings in Navani and Yasna to study the visions, and we get some flashbacks kind of peppered in here and there, showing his strained relationship with Evie, that he barely sees his children, and then finally we see Odium enter his vision and tell Dalinar of the true story, according to Odium, of honor and cultivation, and says that he knows Dalinar will make the right decision and set him free. Lift is somehow in the vision as well, and is convinced by the enemy Odium that they have to do something, and so she'll convince Ga to visit Uruthuru. And that ends part 2. The epigraphs here, I'll note, are Hoid sending letters to the shards, and we get some responses as well. Sounds like he's trying to get help and not going too well at this point. Getting to the interludes, we see Kaza, and we get a deeper look into soul casting via conventional means using an actual soul caster. We've seen glimpses of it, but this really shows the full effect that you eventually will turn into the essence that you soul cast. We find out soul casters, as we know them, were actually created by the Amiens in their ancient city, and that city of Akana is still protected, lest its secrets be found out. We see Taravangian with the Day of Extreme Intelligence, and he changes the diagram and decides that now they'll support Dalinar and then take his place. He decides they have to negotiate with Odium, as they know they can't possibly defeat him. And then we go back to Venli again in the interlude, and we see that she, along with some of the only few listeners left, are to host the Fused as they come in, but she's bonded by something else, and that Spren from Eshernai is still hanging around. So in part 3 we have two main plots. We have Adolin, Shallan, Kaladin, and Elhokar going to try to liberate Kholinar and open the Oathgate, and then we have Dalinar working on forming the Coalition and Dalinar's flashbacks. We'll start with Dalinar, that'll be a little quicker to get through. So he gets permission to visit Thalin's city via Oathgate, and he's not trusted much by the Thalins, so we get this really cool scene where he duels Fenn's son, lets himself lose and be stabbed with the sword, and then pulls it out, and he's supposed to then take his turn with a weapon in the duel, but he spares Fenn's son, earning his respect and winning him over a little bit. He then uses his powers to heal the stone that had been damaged around some of the temples by the Everstorm, and he realizes he needs to learn more about his powers because he doesn't know a lot about how they work. He then approaches the Aegis. He does so alone, but with letters from Queen Fen, Navani, and Yasna, all making logical arguments to try to win the Aegis over to the side as well, and with these letters that he brings, they do decide to finally join. The big moments, though, here really come from the flashbacks as we finally get the whole story of what happened at the Rift. We see Dalinar too caught up in the thrill. He falls into a trap and is almost killed, makes it back to his army, though, and says they're going to burn the entire city of Rathalos down and let nobody survive. It's going to be a supreme example. And he goes in and does it, setting one building where he thinks that the calling himself High Prince is hiding, ends up being the building that Evie's in, that he burns himself, and finds out that he not only slaughtered all of these people, he killed Evie too. He does, to his credit, at some point realize he's gone too far, and that's where we see Sidious keep up the brutality. But once again, we really see this horrible, horrible past of Dalinar that we didn't know about, and even he didn't know about. And it really puts the character into a different perspective, because he was a terrible person, though he is trying to be better now. Now, the mission in Kholinar, there is a lot that happens, and a lot of the events are also tied to showing the characters go through more character development as well. We start with the flight over there. We see Kaladin is still kind of having his thoughts stray to Shallan, still thinking about her in general, still keeps encouraging him because she wants him to be with somebody and be happy in general. They sneak into the city using disguises that were created by Shallan, and they go to Adolin's choice of safe house, which is, of course, his tailor, which is just kind of another Adolin fashion joke, which there are several in this arc as well. So they plan on what they're going to do, and Shallan's going to wear a disguise, get into the palace with a message for the queen. She, to do this, has to reveal herself as Veil to her followers, but not to the others. And then she goes to the palace, and when she tries to get in to see the queen, she's run through with a sword and thrown into a room of corpses. Now, of course, she has Stormlight, so she can heal and escape, but the death really takes a toll on her, and it's really hard for her and kind of gets her in an even worse mental position than she already was. We later see her scouting the city, where she sees Wit, and he tells her tales and then talks about changing the world and tries to encourage her in the right direction with her own personal growth. And also we get some vague hints about Hoyt's past. Kaladin ends up joining with the Wall Guard to find more about Azur, who is, of course, Vivenna from the world of Warbreaker. And then he finally starts to actually see his fellows in the army that are Light Eyes as just people. As a part of the Wall Guard as well, though, he's trying to figure out how they are soul casting without drawing a void spren, and trying to figure that out then. We then see Veil, not Shallan, definitely Veil, continuing to move about the city, and she starts using her crew to steal food from the rich and give to the poor. She's trying to help the poor, but also get the attention of the Cult of Moments, so that she will be invited into the Revel, which Wit was trying to help with as well, and be able to scout and see what she can do about the Oathgate. She does end up getting invited to the Revel of the Cult of Moments, and she starts to really spiral here. And her different identities really start to take on a life of their own, and she starts to lose control. While she's in this mental state, she does find out, though, that Vatha and potentially others are becoming her squires. So that's definitely a big development. Makes sense, though, what we saw with Bridge 4. And then at the Revel, she is disguised and trying to scout, but she ends up getting overwhelmed by the Spren telling her to just give all to it and just join in the Revel and just let everything go, and she has to flee. She then finds out that all of the food she'd given to the poor was actually stolen by gangs, and that she only made things worse and hurt people, didn't help anyone at all. And this really pushes her even deeper over the edge. Meanwhile, an assault where Kaladin uses his Windrunner abilities to help fight the Wall Guard and actually take down a fuse, he ends up revealing himself to Azure, who shows him an aluminum-covered room. They, of course, got the aluminum from Hoyd, but also a nice kind of reference over to Mistborn and Scadrial, where we saw a lot more about what aluminum does. And that's where they're able to soul cast, because the Void Spread can't sense it from in that aluminum room. And then, with all kind of being revealed to each other, Azure decides to take a contingent of the Wall Guard, join them with Elhokar and the Light-Eyed troops that he had gathered as well, to storm the castle. So they go, they storm the castle, the guards are in control of their minds, and they're all fighting against them. The Radiants are leading the fight, and they're, well, very radiant. We see some impressive displays of power, and then Elhokar and Kaladin go to find the Queen, and his son, and Shallan goes to face the Unmade. They find the Queen, but she's inhabited by an Unmade and now has a gem heart from swallowing a stone. And they take Elhokar's son and run. But Kaladin finds himself in the middle of a fight with the Parshmen he traveled with and loses his will to fight, watches the slaughter on both sides around him, and then Mosh shows up, kills Elhokar, just as Elhokar is about to say the first ideal of the Knights Radiant and continue on his path of redeeming himself, but it's not to be. With Shallan, she talks to Sha-Anat, I'm going to assume pronunciation there, and she tells her that the Oathgate is actually a trap, but they decide they have to try anyway, and so Sha-Anat, the Taker of Secrets, one of the Unmade, says she'll try not to kill them, and they end up actually being transported to Shadesmar instead of back to Urithiru. That there ends part 3. So the epigraphs in this section were from the Gem Library, and they open up all kinds of new mysteries that we're going to have to wait and find out about, but also show strife of the Radiants near the end and kind of the mindset that they were in. Getting to the interludes, we start this time with Venli, and she's in Envite form, and her duty is to tell the singers about the past, or at least the version of the past Odium wants them to know, and the Spren is still hanging around her, which makes you wonder, we've been told it's impossible, but can she have a Nahel bond with a Spren? Is it going to be possible? We see then Mem, who's a washerwoman for Mraize, and her part really allows us to see Ash sneaking in to destroy another image of herself that Mraize had as a painting. And then he tells her that he knows where Talon is and tries to recruit her in some way into his plan. Then we see Shellar, and this passage seems a little disjointed from the rest, but we see he's a Herdazian soldier, and they have arrested a light-eyed man who had committed crimes, including assault and theft, and giving him options of how he can die, essentially, and they end up putting him out for a great shell that eats him. This gives us a little bit of a look at Herdaz. It's not a big one, but we haven't actually seen the country before this, so still interesting to see that as well. But now then we start into part 4. With part 4, we see Dalinar's continue toward rock bottom and flashbacks, and we see he's even more of a drunk, blames Evie for what happened, not himself, and he starts to even hate his sons because they remind him of her. He drinks any wine he couldn't get his hands on, and so he thinks that others are trying to hide it from him, and he ends up going to drink with a random beggar who seems to be pretty aware of the Unmade and some other things that are going on, which plays into a big reveal later on as well. These memories and the overwhelming thrill he feels when he goes to Vidnar, where that Spren now is housed, just break him in the current time. And he slips and he gets drunk and spends basically a week just in a daze, drinking constantly all around Levani, desperately is trying to hold the coalition together. In Shadesmar, Shallan creates platforms to get them onto land as they try to determine what to do. Adeline we see feeling just powerless. He doesn't have radiant powers, he doesn't really know what to do, he doesn't understand what's going on, and he wants to help, and he's trying to take charge and help Kaladin anyway, even though he has these feelings. And that's where we kind of see his noble characters. He feels so powerless but wants to help others, and can see that Kaladin and Shallan are struggling and constantly reaches out to try to help. Kaladin then remembers the only other time he froze, the first time he was sparring and was afraid to hurt someone, and he felt the same way when he saw Ka, one of the parshmen he traveled with, and Moshe, and just froze and didn't know what to do. We get Azure confirming she did travel here before through Shadesmar to get to Roshar, and that there's a perpendicularity in the Horn-Eater Peaks. We had had definitely hints of that quite a bit in the other books as well. They're trying to figure out what to do, but they have little time as the bad Spren are coming. We see Kaladin's suppression getting worse as they travel to a lighthouse where they're trying to track down a ship. He goes on alone though and scouts and ends up coming in and seeing Ree, who's an oracle, and he sees a vision through the crystal ball that Dalinar is in danger and that they must reach Thaylen City. The lighthouse keeper Ree makes multiple references, and he mentions first heightenings, confirming that maybe those who are from the world of Warbreaker travel somewhat regularly. He's definitely familiar with it. Then he uses the curse Merciful Domi, which tells us he himself is probably a Lantrian, even though he doesn't have that appearance, so it's still interesting, or maybe it's just showing that mixing around. We know with the 17th shard and all of that kind of going on in the more Cosmi are aware that there is a lot of intermingling, so it's just an interesting little tidbits we see there. Moving on though, we see Seth training with the Skybreakers. His skills are already strong from training with the Honor Blade before, and he already has a very developed sense of justice, so we see him progressing very quickly. But before he swears his third ideal, Nin says he must tell him and the other Skybreakers his deep secrets, and he takes them on a journey and then ends up telling Seth what truly happened at the final desolation, that the Heralds did betray them, and confirms that he actually joined his own order and is not just a Herald, but a Radiant of the 5th Ideal. He then tells Seth he's the first Skybreaker to swear his third ideal in this new world, and that he'll have difficult choices to make, and that he may have to make different choices from the other Skybreakers. Back in Shadesmar, the group does get on a ship to Espren City, and they trade for supplies, but then are in danger as the Fused are coming and looking for them. They end up escaping on a ship of Honor Spren, in part because they had apprehended Syl, who was apparently still in trouble from the Honor Spren city because she had ran away to bond Kaladin. As they are moving, they find out Azure is actually going to stay with the Honor Sprint, and she's going to trade information in order to get brought somewhere else. But after Kaladin tells the Honor Sprint that he has to get to Thaylen City to protect Dalinar, the bondsmith, who bonded Stormfather, the biggest iteration of honor, they agree to help and let them go and get them close to Thaylen City as they can, as the Fused are chasing the ship. So Kaladin and the others do go to escape, and begin moving their way on foot to Thaylen City. Before they leave the ship, though, we do see Shallan really truly fracturing, losing control of her identities, having Vale take over and Lyric Kaladin, and having Radiant take over, and seeing that Vale and Radiant both actually kind of want Kaladin over Adeline. But Adeline comes and he comforts her, and he seems to see the real her, and that once again grounds her and makes her feel safe, and it really brings her back to herself, which is going to be needed as they are in a lot of danger with the Fused chasing them. And when they get to the Oathgate, finally they find a Voidspren army blocking their path. In the physical realm, Dalinar is starting to recover, and he realizes Thaylen City, not Yakaven, is going to be attacked. His flashbacks also show a turning point at Gavilar's funeral, where he kind of finally realizes he needs to make a change, and he hears Yasna reading The Way of Kings, the first time that he actually hears that, and kind of starts pushing him a little bit in the right direction. He decides to pull Venli into a vision and sue for peace one last time, but her fear of Odium is too great, and she knows she can't stand against him. Odium ends up invading the vision, but he lets Venli go, and takes on the pain of Odium's presence all by himself. Then in Thaylen City, the Coalition meets, and they're planning the defense, but we see Taravangian's betrayal that was talked about a little bit earlier finally come into play. The others hear that Dalinar was to be High King and think he really is trying to conquer. They hear about his vision where he met Odium, now thinking maybe he's being influenced by the enemy. And they hear the true story, the big reveal, that the Radiants found out that caused the Recreants, that humans are actually Voidbringers. After destroying their own world, they came to Rashar. They were given Shinovar, but they weren't satisfied with that, and ended up, of course, conquering and bringing Odium with them. This news makes the Coalition shatter. With that happening, that ends part 4. The epigraphs we saw in this section were about the Unmade, and we still have the Unmade to an extent, and the sibling that's mentioned, the third of the Stormfather and Nightwatcher, still remain a mystery, so that's definitely still more to come as well. With the interludes here, we see Venli being brought to join the assault of Thaylen City. The Fused do note here what I thought was interesting, that they will leave once the war is won, that they don't really want to rule, they just want to set up the Singers to take over again and have their own land. We see Risen with an important part where she now works for the Queen's Treasury after her injury on the Reshi Isles. She can't walk. We see her old Bapsk Vistum, who is also retiring from trading to take a government position. They go to audit the Gemstone Reserve, and then a Fused using some form of light weaving, who is disguised, kills the guards and tries to steal what's called the King's Drop, which is a perfect ruby that can hold Stormlight. It tries to get away with it, but we see the Larkin that Risen had is able to also eat Void Light, and after draining the light from the Fused, they're able to defeat him before being all killed. So, interesting piece there that plays in really quickly also as well. And then we see Teft, and he finds that a man wearing his own coat that he has sold to get more fire moss came and attacked Bridge 4. Many people are wounded, possibly dead, and that they had stolen the Honor Blade. He begs his friend that he had bonded to leave him and find somebody more worthy. He feels he's finally lived up to his self-fulfilling prophecy of betraying Bridge 4 like he's betrayed everyone else. So part 5 is a bit of a doozy. We have a couple of really long chapters where there's so much happening, and this is where we really get the action. So instead of kind of focusing on each bit, I'm going to kind of play-by-play it and just go from here because there is just so much going on. So we're powering through to the end here. So first, we get a flashback of Dalinar's meeting with the Night Watcher. We see that Cultivation herself actually stepped in and instead gave what happened to Dalinar, and she pruned his memory so that he could be a better man, but she did fear that by doing so, and having him forget these terrible things he'd done, that he may become a weapon for Odium. As the battle in Thaylen City starts, through betrayal, Parshmen are also attacking Urthru at the same time and keeping them from bringing in reinforcements. And we then see Odium use the passion of Sidious's army and their feelings of betrayal at the death of High Prince Sidious. They're then turned against the Thaylens and have Voidspren bonding them, and they turn and start to attack Thaylen City. The Unmade that controls the Thrill also is present here as well at the battle, and we just have this huge epic showdown getting started. So the Oathgate Spren and Shadesmar say they will not open the gate to the physical realm, that Honor had barred them from allowing travel between cognitive and physical realms. And Kaladin's fighting the Fused, trying to buy time for Shallan to figure something else out. He runs out of Stormlight. Adolin was fighting the Shall's illusions, but then the Fused figured out. He gets stabbed, and things are not going particularly well. We see Lift arrive, and she's trying to get the ruby to Dalinar. Seth arrives and then confirms the Skybreakers have chosen the side of the Dawnsingers and that they'll follow their laws, but Seth says he'll follow the law of Dalinar, and that's going to be his third ideal. With this, then, we go back to Dalinar. He offers a contest of champions to Odium, and he's trying to figure out if this is the right thing to do. He goes for it, he offers it, and finds out that Odium has actually chosen Dalinar as his champion, as he's been preparing him for a long, long time. We see then Seth fighting, and he loses Nightblood's sheath, and slowly Nightblood begins to consume him as he runs out of Stormlight. Lift shows up trying to help, and she's getting consumed as well. Back in Shadesmar, Kaladin can't say his fourth ideal. Syl's telling him to do so, but he can't do it. And then we flash back to Teft in Urthru. He can't say his third ideal either. In Shadesmar, we see Adolin's dead Spren attack one of the Fused who's trying to kill him. We see back then in Thaylen City, Ash arrive and find Talon, but he's still catatonic. We get more confirmation that Renarin had bonded with a corrupted Spren. He sees a vision of his death, that Yasna is going to kill him, and that Dalinar is going to submit to Odium. Odium has been influencing Dalinar a very long time, we find out with this, but Yasna decides she's not going to kill him, and then he realizes his visions can be wrong. Dalinar confronts Odium, and we have the epic moment where Odium is telling him to give in, give his pain. It's not his fault, any of the terrible things he did. Dalinar has to accept that those are things that he did. Those are part of him. And we have just the epic, you can't have my pain moment. He refuses to give in to Odium, and instead, he joins the pieces of honor that are left and ascends, becoming unity. And he opens up honor's perpendicularity, combining all three realms, allowing him to re-infuse all of the spheres and gems that are laying all about Thaylen City here, and give a wealth of Stormlight to the Radiance. From here, the Radiance just explode with power after all of that Stormlight, and we get some really epic displays. We see Dalinar going off now to face the Thrill after Odium retreats. We see Yasna, who's going to hold the gap in the wall all on her own. Adolin's going off to fight the Thunderclass, and Kaladin is busy fighting Amaran, who has now fused with another of the Unmade and is slowly growing this like purple crystal carapace. And he also fights Fused, who are using their carapace as almost shard plate or shard blade, growing around them, changing the weapon that they have with this kind of living carapace, which makes you think that's probably what the shards were designed by in the first place. Anyway, Dalinar is facing the Thrill, and he accepts it. He understands it. He has to recognize that this too is a part of himself, and the Thrill gave him strength when he needed it, even if it was to do terrible things. We see Venli swear the first ideal, answering that question from earlier. Adolin summons his blade, who he now knows is named Maya, in less than 10 heartbeats. He's almost killed by a Thunderclass anyway, though, and then Radiant Renarin shows up to help. Lift comes up with a plan to use an illusion with Seth and Shallan to make the Fuse think that they have the real ruby, whereas Lift actually takes the real ruby to try to get it to Dalinar. Amaran, in his fight with Kaladin, still thinks he's doing the honorable thing, but Kaladin makes him face his pain and see that it wouldn't still be there if he truly was in the right. He almost defeats Amaran, but then the Fused swoop in to stop him. Renarin, who is maybe not quite radiant with bonding with a corrupted Spren, but something new, potentially. Either way, he uses Stormlight to make the soul flee from the Thunderclass, and then goes to open the Oath Gate. Shallan on the field with both Veil and Radiant by her side, she's created this just massive army of illusions, and she's using Stormlight to actually get them substance to keep the human soldiers that were turned by the Void Spren distracted. Yasna, after soul casting the gap on the wall into bronze, comes in to help as well. We go back to Renner, and he reaches the Oath Gate, but there are too many Fused guarding it. He then sees a vision, though, smiles, and then suddenly Radiant Teft and Bridge 4 come through, bearing a few thousand troops. We then see Lift reach Dalinar with the gem, and he realizes that someone like him, someone who understands the Thrill, someone who's familiar with it, similar to as Shallan was with the Unmade earlier in part 1, he's the one who can do what needs to be done and trap it in this perfect gem that has no flaws and so is able to hold the Unmade, and does so. Kaladin, still though in a desperate fight with the Fused and Amaran, is rescued as Rock draws a shard bow and slays Amaran. Now though, with the Thrill trapped inside the gemstone, the last strength of Amaran's men and the Fused is gone, and they lose the will to fight and retreat, or some of the human soldiers lay broken where they were, and it's all over. So much happened in that very long chapter. That was mostly all one chapter, that part of the battle, but really we got to see the full potential of what the Radiants can do, even when they haven't sworn all their ideals yet, and the last 2 chapters in the epilogue then are still falling action, but still a lot of important things happen. So Navani goes to Dalinar. She confirms that Gavilar also had a stone that potentially had one of the Unmade in it. Dalinar says he wants to learn how to read. We get Shallan, and she finally decides that she's her, and that Adolin knows the real her, and she chooses him over Kaladin when Adolin tries to kind of step back and let them be together because he thinks that's what she wants. And Shallan realizes that she truly loves Adolin, and he truly loves the real her. They set their wedding officially for a week out, just before then Adolin is going to be crowned as the High Prince because he refused to become king of Lethkar, and so instead, Yasna is crowned as Queen of Lethkar. We see Seth officially swear his ideal to follow Dalinar as law, and we see Nin that, although he's on the other side, respects the decision and says he will still train Seth on the other surge that goes with the Order as well. We see Taravangian telling Dalinar part of the truth, at least, that he did abandon him, and it appears just maybe he's no longer against Dalinar, maybe a little bit. We see Lopen, of course Lopen, swear the second ideal becoming radiant in a very silly way. Moshe then, after killing a king, is told next he's to kill a god. He's given a special knife and told to kill the beggar, who was really Jezrien, king of the heralds, all along. Ash, who's still in Thaylen City with Tal, realizes what's happened and is horrified, not sure how they can actually destroy his soul. And Yasna, who was looking for those two by their real descriptions somehow, does end up finding them. Kaladin then goes off on an important mission and finds Drahi and Scar, now both also Radiants, and they had saved Elhokar's son, and also Shallan's crew there with them as well. Shallan's brothers then arrive, as the Ghostbloods promised, just in time for the wedding, and Shallan finally realizes it's okay to be happy as herself, and that she doesn't have to feel bad, even though there's a lot of bad in the world, she can enjoy the good. And she's also given a mission by the Ghostbloods to get Sa-Anat either on their side or to capture her. We see then Moshe given the stolen honor blade, and he becomes Vyre, and we see him truly change sides 100%. Then we see Taravangian, of course, still not on the right side, and he actually meets with Odium while he's having a bad day, and we see really the extent of it. Not only is he still working against Dalinar, he's actually makes a deal with Odium, negotiates that Kharbranth will be saved while everything else may be destroyed. We then find out that Dalinar is the one who is writing Oathbringer, which, like I said, it became relevant. The passages earlier, I still didn't like those epigraphs, but pretty big because, in Roshar, men don't write, so big deal. And then in the epilogue, we see Wit leaving Kholinar in disguise so that Thewst won't stop him, and it's revealed that not only does he have healing power, but also we see him using Awakening, and then he bonds a Cryptic. So that is the end of Oathbringer, and wow, just so much happening there. So I know this is another long video, but there was just a ton to talk to, and I find myself still so excited for Rhythm of War, which I will start reading the second that it arrives at my house tomorrow, when it's delivered. I had it pre-ordered for a while. With that, if you enjoyed this video, feel free to give it a like. If you want to see my additional content, then feel free to subscribe.